And so what we're going to discuss today is our general approach to expanding movement variability at the foot and at the ankle. So specifically, what we're going to initially talk about are some key biomechanical features that guide our understanding when we're trying to go about, and our thought process when we're going to go about expanding movement at the foot and at the ankle, and restore the capacity to generate forces across the ankle and across the foot. Then we're going to specifically focus on how we can go about expanding foot pronation, and then how we can couple that with loaded ankle plantar flexion, and then we'll come back to talk about how we can expand foot supination, and then couple that with loaded ankle plantar flexion again. The reason we think it's important to discuss the biomechanical features here in a little bit more detail first is, and I'm sure lots of you are aware of this, is in the rehab space now, there is a lot more emphasis placed on the variability within the foot, meaning how well these individual bony segments can move relative to each other. Because what that will do is it will increase the space that we have within the foot to spread stress, to spread forces and loads. And what that then does is it allows our whole lower limb to better dampen forces and better manage forces, meaning if I have some space distally in the foot, that will reduce the rate of loading, the amount of force and strain that the proximal tissues will experience if I have space in the foot to be able to manage that. So there is a large emphasis on looking at the movement of individual segments. But what's happened then as a result is there is less focus placed on the force generation capacity through muscular tissues. And so what I tend to see clinically a lot are individuals, particularly online, who have been doing lots of foot mobility drills that they've gotten from YouTube, online, and they're working away on those, trying to expand the movement options within their foot. But then they've completely neglected the muscular capacity of the tissues to generate forces, because that's really what drives adaptation. You can try and create movement between segments, but if you cannot couple that movement between segments and the movement options you've created between two individual segmental interactions, if you can't allow for that to occur as you simultaneously tolerate greater forces through the muscular tissues, then you're probably not going to be able to hold on to that range of motion you've generated or you've created via those two individual bony segments. And this is when you see a lot of people focusing on pronation drills, supination drills, without actually coupling that with higher levels of force through the foot and the ankle. So one of the key things that I try to consider is both, really, in a rehab setting. So I see a lot of people with foot and ankle pain that's chronic in nature, and many of these clients do have limitations in the range of motion between segments within the foot, but they also have limitations in their force production capacity via the ankle plantar flexors. So when you ask them to do a calf raise, for example, they may only be able to do 1 or 2 calf raises until they struggle, or they may have pain when they do a calf raise. So it doesn't actually give you a clear insight into whether or not they have the ability to do the calf raise, because pain is limiting their ability to do the calf raise. Okay, so then you have a situation where, okay, do I just back off the load and try to gradually increase the amount of force through the ankle plantar flexors? Or is that pain the result maybe of a lack of range of motion within the foot? And so maybe by expanding some of that motion within the foot, I can then spread the force more broadly, which may mean that I can generate force via ankle plantar flexion without as much pain. Because generally when we lose variability and movement options within the foot, it's going to mean that we tend to concentrate more force around the ankle or somewhere within the foot as well, meaning we can have a pain experience. So a lack of variability, again, reduces the space, the options that we have to spread forces. And that is afforded to your movement system by range of motion within joints, between interacting segments, but also in the capacity of muscular tissues to be able to generate forces. And this really reflects those two key concepts within biomechanics, or fields of study, areas of study within biomechanics, which is your kinematics and your kinetics. Kinematics represents the position of joints, the position of segments relative to each other and in space, or the movement of segments, the motion of segments. But it doesn't also include, or it doesn't also represent the forces that create that motion. That would be a kinetic understanding. That looks at the forces that move through our system, the external forces. Think of the ground reaction forces that move through the system as a result of the interaction of the foot with the ground, how they move through the system. Those are external forces. They move through the system and they challenge muscular tissues to generate appropriate internal forces via muscular contractions. And so, yes, when external force comes into our system, if we have space within the foot, we have more space to spread that force. But if we don't also have the ability to contract muscular tissues in an effort to handle that external force, to manage that external force, then that range of motion is really no good, okay? Because again, we need both, okay? So when you see people doing lots of low load, very low intensity foot mobility drills, I always question how long are they going to be able to hold on to that range of motion if they're not coupling that also with ankle plantarflexion in a loaded manner. So what I like to do an awful lot of the time is combine both early on, particularly when I have a client that has limitations in movement at the foot, but also has limitations in generating forces via ankle plantarflexion. I generally, again, when you're looking at someone do a calf raise, for example, and you see the calcaneus lift from the ground, sometimes you might see a client do something like this where they'll quickly invert the calcaneus, the weight will shift laterally, and they'll lose that weight through the first metatarsal head. That may reflect that this individual is avoiding pronation. Maybe they are biased towards more supination. But you'll also see clients that start with very pronated feet, a lot of calcaneal eversion, and when they do a calf raise, they struggle to actually supinate the foot. They struggle to invert the calcaneus. And so both of those motions I just showed you there involve generating force via ankle plantarflexion to project our center of mass vertically. But both represent different foot behaviors as they generate that force. So generally what I want to enable in many of my clients with foot and ankle limitations is, one, they have the ability to express foot pronation, but also handle force via ankle plantarflexion. And then two, they have the ability to express foot supination and also generate force via ankle plantarflexion. Now, the process that we work through to get to that point will be different for every single individual. Sometimes you have to actually forget about foot motion for a period of time and just start to get some general load into the ankle plantar flexors. Other times, you may have to forget about loading the ankle plantar flexors as much, or maybe you bring the load down very, very low, and we'll show you some examples, practical examples of that as well across this video, as you simultaneously get that load into the foot and the ankle. So what we'll do first here in the next portion of this video is discuss some of the key components of foot pronation and foot supination that we need to express before we start to couple that with ankle plantarflexion. Okay, so let's discuss what has to happen to afford the ability for the foot to pronate. Generally, and to supinate. And generally, the way I like to look at this is by understanding what has to happen proximally to the midfoot to encourage this, and what has to happen distally at the forefoot to encourage this motion at the midfoot. So generally with pronation, we're going to see the medial arch drop, the tarsal bones unlock and become a bit more flexible, where there's a little bit more relative movement between those segments. And then as we supinate, we're going to see a lifting of the medial arch. So let's look at this distally first, because I think distally at the forefoot, it's a little bit easier to understand. So when I lift that medial arch, and I'm essentially kind of abducting and externally rotating the shank here, the tibial segment, to create that. But look what happens at the first metatarsal. At the first metatarsal, what you're going to see is a lifting of the first metatarsal proximally and a dropping of the first metatarsal distally. And this is essentially a plantar flexion of the first metatarsal. And this is what's needed to afford the ability of the midfoot to lift. Okay, so you can imagine that as that proximal first metatarsal lifts, it's going to facilitate a lifting of the medial arch. And so the opposite occurs again with a dorsiflexion of the first metatarsal. As the proximal end of the first metatarsal drops, the distal end will lift. So it will create a dorsiflexion of the first metatarsal. And again, as that proximal end drops, that will encourage a dropping of the medial arch. So one of the key things that has to happen distally at the foot is for the metatarsal heads, specifically the first metatarsal, to dorsiflex or to lift. Okay, that's very important. And generally what that does as well is that as that first metatarsal lifts, it will actually create an external rotation of the forefoot. Okay, this is kind of when you'll generally kind of consider this dissociation between the rear foot and the forefoot, because if you imagine that the forefoot externally rotates, so if you were to look at this on a, not necessarily on a clock face, but just relative to the rest of the body. So this is the left foot, right? So when that forefoot rotates in this direction, when the first metatarsal head lifts, it will create a rotation outwards. So it will create a rotation to the left. And because it's the left foot we're looking at, that is a rotation outwards. It's an external rotation, a lateral rotation, which is a rotation away from the midline. Let's look at this then within the context of what's happening at the rear foot. So in order for the foot to pronate, we will need the calcaneus to evert. Okay, and a calcaneal eversion is actually a rotation towards the midline. So again, watch the calcaneus there. If I evert the calcaneus, that is rotating towards the midline. It's actually rotating to the right. This is the left foot. So when the calcaneus rotates to the right, that would be a rotation towards the midline. It's an internal rotation. That's a rotation towards the midline. What that will facilitate is a dropping of the talus, an adduction of the talus, which again will also allow for a dropping of the medial arch. And typically that will couple with an internal rotation of the shank, of the tibia. This is kind of a very predictable coupling behavior that you see within the research as well. I'll show you kind of a cadaver picture of what this looks like on the screen somewhere now as well, where when that tibia externally rotates, it will naturally create an inversion of the calcaneus. As it externally rotates, it'll create an inversion of the calcaneus. As it internally rotates, it will create an eversion of the calcaneus. Okay, it's a very predictable coupling behavior. Okay, coupling behavior essentially represents a relationship between segments. The opposing segmental behavior occurs with supination, where the calcaneus has to invert. That can be facilitated by an external rotation of the tibia, which will drag that calcaneus into inversion. So let's discuss what we may need to facilitate in order to further facilitate foot pronation. What I like to use, and I know lots of people use wedges and things like that, but I actually like to use towels, rolled up towels, because what that allows me to do then is it creates a better platform upon which I can drive force via the metatarsal heads into that surface to generate forces via loaded ankle plantarflexion. If you have your metatarsal head, for example, or your metatarsal heads over a wedge that has more rigidity, it's a little bit tougher to generate force into that to actually get some load into the muscular tissues. They're great for kind of using your body weight to create motion, but they're not great to couple that motion with loading of the muscular tissues. So you can couple that together. So I generally like to start clients with a very simple starting point. I like to just position the metatarsal heads across a rolled up towel. That gives me space then. So I'm going to show you on the screen here what this looks like from behind and from the side as well. What that does is it gives me space to drop that medial arch into. So what I'm going to do in this situation here, and you're going to see it on the screen now, is that I'm going to pre-position the forefoot where I want it, and then I'm going to use the proximal part of the body where I'm going to rotate the pelvis towards the right-hand side, because we're looking at the left foot here. So I have to rotate the pelvis towards the midline, which is to the right side, because this is the left foot. That's going to drag the femur into internal rotation. It's going to drag the tibia into internal rotation, and it's going to then couple with an E version of the calcaneus. That's going to help me facilitate some level of lengthening through the medial arch. Is it creating dissociation within the foot? No, but it's getting us some general movement, mobility, variability within the foot. But what I'll typically do then is I'll maintain that position and ask the client then to gently crush the metatarsal heads, the forefoot, into the towel, and then raise into a heel raise, just slightly off the ground here. And we can hold that in an isometric manner. Or what I like to do is small dynamic partial ranges of motion. Because moving into a partial range of motion here, loading the ankle plantarflexors, biases the ankle and biases the ankle into dorsiflexion and maintains the foot in pronation. So I'm loading the plantar flexors at length, but also while the foot maintains a foot pronated behavior. This can be very challenging for clients, particularly if they are biasing a supinated foot behavior early on. And many clients that have had limitations within the foot, maybe they had a stiff foot, a rigid foot for a long period of time, they may tell you that they feel some pressure and maybe some discomfort across the midfoot, across the dorsum of the foot. In which case, you don't just avoid that, but you just lighten the load acting on the ankle plantar flexors. And all you do, I'm going to show you here on the screen as well, is you offload the weight of the head, arms and trunk onto a table or onto a chair, which will show you. All this does is it means that the ankle has to plantar flex against less weight, against less load. Okay? So that's a very general way of going about doing that. One way we can progress that then is by moving. I'm going to show you here. I'll show you here. Maybe you might see it a bit more clearly. I'm going to move the first metatarsal. I'm going to move from having all the metatarsal heads across the edge of the towel here to just having the first metatarsal head positioned on the corner of that towel. That's going to then allow for me to create a little bit more external rotation of that forefoot to allow me to drop a little bit further into that foot pronation. Okay, you're going to see that on the screen here as well. Maybe it looks a little bit clearer here. And you'll have to manipulate the height of the towel. So I can drop the towel down to make it less externally rotated. Of course, if I use a really thick towel, it's going to throw me off to the lateral edge of the foot. But if you try this, again, I would encourage you to try this relative to a wedge. What you'll find is that it's a little bit easier to generate force through the first metatarsal head and couple that with a little bit of internal rotation of everything proximally, drive down through the first metatarsal head, and then raise the heel off the ground via loaded ankle plantar flexion. You can hold that isometrically, you can maintain everything proximally, and then go through a partial range of motion as well. But that is a great way to initially encourage a pronation of the foot as you simultaneously couple that with loaded ankle plantar flexion. Because one of the things that we have to consider here then, if clients are struggling with continued limitation, is do I need to go deeper into trying to expand that range of motion within the foot, or do I just need to couple what I have from a range of motion standpoint within the foot with a better ability to generate forces via the muscular tissues that move through the back of the shin into the sole of the foot as well. And to me, what I see clinically is that too often we try to go too deep into creating motion in the foot and not enough with combining that motion that we have in the foot with increased internal muscular force generation via the ankle plantar flexors. And generally what you'll find here in clients is that they will experience a lot more demand on the ankle plantar flexors because you are loading the ankle plantar flexors on top of a foot now that is a much more mobile, that is much more flexible, and very often that will increase the experience of force on the ankle plantar flexors, because typically when we load the ankle plantar flexors, we are more often generating that force on top of a foot that is more supinated, which is a more rigid foot, which again reduces a lot of the flexibility within the foot, making it easier generally for the ankle plantar flexors to handle that force. So next we'll talk about what it looks like when we're trying to express foot pronation and couple that with ankle plantar flexion. Okay, so now let's discuss how we can promote foot supination and couple that with loaded ankle plantar flexion. One of the key things with foot supination, like we mentioned before, is being able to express that plantar flexion of the first metatarsal, which is a dropping of the metatarsal distally and a lifting of the metatarsal proximally. One thing that will facilitate this is a lifting of the big toe into extension. If you were to place your foot in front of you right now and you extend your toes, particularly your big toe, you will feel your metatarsal head drop into the ground, and as a result that will create a lifting of the medial arch. So using the big toe to our advantage here can help facilitate that. The problem here though is understanding when that big toe will extend during loaded ankle plantar flexion. That's going to happen during loaded ankle plantar flexion in the end range of ankle plantar flexion, meaning we have much less load through the ankle plantar flexors because they're actively insufficient there. They're in their shortest length position, meaning they're not really experiencing that much tension. So how do we go about trying to manipulate foot behavior, get that big toe extension, as we simultaneously get load into the ankle plantar flexors, but while they're experiencing more tension and load? We do this by shifting into a forward angle calf raise against the wall. Because if I come into a forward angle calf raise, what happens then is that as I generate force, I'm not actually projecting my body upwards, meaning that shin is going to stay a little bit more vertical and the center of rotation of the ankle will shift up and then forward, and we'll eventually get that big toe to extend. But what's going to happen when I generate force in more of a forward angle position, which I'll show you on the screen here now in just a moment, is that when I generate force up and forward, I'm going to get that big toe extension much sooner. But what's going to happen then is that I'm going to still be in the mid-range of the ankle position as that big toe is extended, compared to this position here if I'm generating force upwards. If I'm here and I'm loading up and forward I should say, the big toe is extending, but now my ankle still isn't in end range plantar flexion. So now what I have is a foot that is more biased towards supination and an ankle that's in its mid-range position. And when I generate that force up and forward, I'm still getting load into the ankle plantar flexors, but when they're more biased in a mid-range to lengthened position. Okay, so you're going to see that on the screen here, where I'm setting up with a forward shin angle. We can get a little bit of a bend in the knee as well. I'm driving force down through the metatarsal heads, but I'm driving that force up and forward. And in this position, I like to hang out in that mid-range and just go through partial ranges of motion there. Okay, now we can couple that with a light bit of load through the big toe flexors as well. And we can also couple that with a rotation proximally of the pelvis, the femur, the tibia, into lateral rotation, which will encourage that supination from the rear foot as well. Okay, now this is a really kind of, I wouldn't say uncommon, but you just don't see it as an exercise utilized to facilitate foot supination. Because again, the problem, like I mentioned, is that when we're getting into that position where the foot is really biased towards supination, is in that end range loaded ankle plantar flexion. Now you could say that we can position the big toe in extension like this, and then we can hover the heel off the ground where we are still biased towards that mid-range ankle position. I'll show you what that looks like on the screen here as well. But that's going to be very uncomfortable because now you have the first metatarsal head driving into the ground where it's more projected into the ground. It's not going to feel very comfortable on the metatarsal heads unless you're doing it on a soft surface. So if you're pre-positioning the toe in extension and then driving through the metatarsal heads and just hovering that heel off the ground, you're still getting load into the ankle plantar flexors when they're in their mid-range. You're still biasing the foot towards supination, but it just does not feel comfortable on the metatarsal heads in that position. From my experience with clients, it's much easier to get into that forward angle position of the calf raise, drive that load up and forward towards the wall. If the client really struggles here, simple place to start is just do both legs together. What I generally find is that when you do both legs together, a double leg strategy, it makes it easier for the client to bring more tension into the crush through the toe flexors into the ground as well. And you can bias that load into one side then eventually. So you can start with 50-50 and then shift 60% into the target side, 40% into the non-target side. And then you can eventually work up into a single leg strategy as well. But these are two very, very simple strategies, but they do make up a large bulk of what I utilize when I'm trying to influence the movement variability around the foot, because I'm using the segmental behaviors distally and the segmental behaviors proximally to influence what's happening at the midfoot, but then I'm coupling that with loaded ankle plantar flexion as well. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through what these exercises look like in a little bit more detail. Now, with this initial one where we are setting up the metatarsal heads on the edge of the towel roll here, this is a general one, remember, because we're not really getting that external rotation of the forefoot where we're just driving the dorsiflexion at the first metatarsal. But when you have a client that has stiff feet for a prolonged period of time, you don't want to get too picky with how you are creating directional motion within the foot. You just want to get general motion across the foot, and you want to get a general lengthening of the medial arch. This provides that ability. Also, like I said, we need to consider that when we're trying to open up the foot and get load simultaneously into the plantar flexors, we need to be aware that this may be the first time the client's experiencing that. And so I often find that when you do that, when your head, arms and trunk are stacked over top your foot and you are plantar flexing your whole body mass, that can be quite challenging for clients. And generally, initially, I actually want the client to express more repetitions, get more time under tension with this, with lower load. That's why I have a chair in front now, because it allows me to offload the mass of the head, arms and trunk and allow me to get more reps, more time under tension through the plantar flexors as the foot is biasing more pronation. So I'll show you what this looks like now. So I'm going to stand up, I'm going to put the first metatarsal head just on the edge of the towel here so you can see. And all I'm going to do here is I'm going to rotate my pelvis. Again, you can't see my head now, but you should be able to see my pelvis. I'm going to rotate my pelvis to the right. Now, what I typically tell clients is I tell them to imagine they have a clock face. You have 12 o'clock in front. I want them to turn the pelvis to the right towards 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock perhaps, depending on how much motion I want to get into the foot. But generally, again, I want to get a little bit of a bend of the knee. That allows for a little bit more of a rotation of the tibia internally relative to the foot. Of course, we're getting more of an external rotation of the tibia relative to the femur. But what that's going to do then, you should see that dropping of the medial arch. And then I'm going to offload the rear leg. I can keep that on the ground for a bit of balance if I want to as well. And all I'm going to do here is I'm going to crush down through the metatarsal heads with a bit more bias through the first metatarsal head, and I'm going to raise the heel off the ground. Now I can just hold that there as a yielding isometric. Or what I generally like to do to get some dynamic motion here is I like to drop the heel and then lift. Drop the heel and lift, keeping that rotation of the pelvis to the right. Drop and lift. So the reason I'm just going through a partial range in this end range is because when we're biased towards dorsiflexion, that's going to couple with pronation of the foot as well. Not always, but you're naturally going to pronate the foot more easily when the foot or when the ankle is biased towards dorsiflexion. So I don't want to go through a full range of motion here, because naturally when I go through a full range, I want that foot to be able to supinate. So that's why I'm biasing the dynamic motion towards dorsiflexion here. And you can see here that because I have my weight distributed over the chair here, it makes it much more easy for me to express multiple reps. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how we might progress to challenging the dissociation between the forefoot and rear foot a little bit more. But again, it's not fancy. We're using a towel roll because we are trying to engage the plantar flexors simultaneously. But also I like to use this because it's much more convenient for the client to use at home. They can integrate it into their day-to-day life a lot more easy, and we can get more repetitions and more frequent exposure of this into their daily lives. So we'll just switch the position of the towel to the point where I have my first metatarsal head over top the corner of the towel. And of course, we don't want to have the towel too thick because that's going to push me to the lateral edge of the foot a bit too much. But we want to express the same proximal behavior, same pelvic motion, same femoral tibial motion, slight little knee bend, and go through that partial motion as we maintain that load through the first metatarsal head. So I'm going to show you what this looks like now. I'm going to show you on the right side here. So we'll take the foot, position the first metatarsal head just on the corner of the towel. You're going to look down at your foot now. You're going to see that it's mainly the first metatarsal head that lifts from the towel here. We're going to elevate this side. We can rotate away. So the right foot, we're rotating to the left. Slight little knee bend. Hold that position there. Crush through the metatarsal head. Elevate the heel slightly and then drop back down. Gently touch the ground with the heel and back up. Again, I'm using the chair for a little bit of support now. You should be able to see that calcaneus is everted and getting length into the medial arch, but I'm coupling that pronation position, that more flexible foot, with some low dynamic isotonic loading of the ankle plantar flexors. Not just trying to get motion into the foot. Now, generally, I like to work towards 15 to 20 repetitions. And then what I'll do is I will check the client's response. So if I do that for 15 to 20 reps, I'll then check the client's response. I'll check whatever motion that was limited to begin with. I'm not expecting any magic changes after one set, but I just want to check to see how they responded. Is it painful? Did I do too much? Do I need to offload the mass of the head, arms and trunk even more so? Might I have to start with an isometric instead? Or if the client feels good and they felt like it wasn't that challenging, then I can increase the reps, or what I can do is I can progress to the point where I'm not using the chair for extra support in front. I'm progressing to using the wall for support, where I have my head, arms and trunk stacked over my foot. Okay, so let's progress into this supination biased calf raise using that forward lean or forward angle calf raise. Now, I did mention that I don't like to pre-position the toe in extension as we're doing a calf raise, your standard calf raise. What I meant by that is I don't like to have the client position the toe in extension like this, for example, where I have the toe like that and then doing a calf raise, because you can imagine the metatarsal heads are just crushing into the ground. It doesn't feel very comfortable on the metatarsal heads when you do that. But you can certainly use a wedge, which is a bit more comfortable, to position the big toe in extension, come up into this standing position, elevate the heel from the ground. So again, I'm still biased in a mid-range position of the ankle here. I can crush the toe in, I can crush the metatarsal head into the wedge as well. Not as easy as crushing the big toe into the wedge though. And I can hold that position there. You can see that the foot is a bit more supinated. I'll show you from behind as well. And we can go through dynamic calf raises here as well. The key thing here though is that I'm going to try to do a dynamic calf raise, not biased towards dorsiflexion, but biased towards plantar flexion. So I'm going to come to the mid-range and go up. Come back to the mid-range and up. And that's how it'll look when I do the forward lean calf raise as well. I'll show you a bigger picture of what this looks like as well on the screen. But generally, and I did mention that we can do this with both feet first, that makes it a bit easier for the client to get that intentional crush through the big toe flexors, because sometimes when you put someone on a single leg, you put a lot of demand on that leg, and so it's very difficult to ask the toe flexors to take all that load. Generally, you're going to feel that just into the calves. But when you have both legs loading, it distributes the pressure across both legs, which gives you a greater opportunity to experience that crush through the big toe flexors. You'll see what I mean when you try it. But I'm going to show you with one leg here. So I'm setting up in a little bit more dorsiflexion at the beginning with my body leaning forward towards the wall. I like to have the clients extend their elbows so they don't feel like they're doing a tricep isometric at the same time. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to elevate this front leg here. And I'm going to rise up onto the toes here. And you can see that as I rise up onto the toes, I'm actually in a mid-range position of dorsiflexion now. But I have a lot more toe extension. Whereas if I did it here, for example, if I'm just rising up here and I'm in mid-range dorsal, or in the mid-range position of the ankle, slightly plantar flexed, I don't have that much toe extension. So that makes the big difference here is that when I'm in this position here, and I go from being very dorsiflexed to the mid-range, now in the mid-range, I have a lot more toe extension. So I'm elevating here, I'm crushing down through the big toe. Again, you can crush down through the metatarsal head as well, but I'm trying to direct that force up and forward towards the wall. So I can do that as an isometric, or what I can do is I can do a partial range up, back to the mid-range, up, back to the mid-range, up, back to the mid-range, all while I'm crushing that big toe down into the ground as well. Now I can add a bit more of a pelvic twist as well. I'll show you what that looks like from behind. I can hold that as an isometric. You'll see a little bit more supination be expressed into the foot as well. You might feel that more into the arch, burning sensation into the arch, and then we can go through dynamic repetitions there as well. Now we don't want to do this where you're just driving the pelvis up and we're almost kind of dropping the shin back the way. We want to project the body up and forward towards the wall. So we're actually getting that load into the plantar flexors. If I'm just driving the pelvis up to the ceiling, I'm not really keeping that tension on the plantar flexors and coupling that with supination. Okay, so that's it for me. Hopefully that helped give you some practical tools to begin changing the variability around the foot and the ankle. Just to recap what we spoke about, we considered some key biomechanical features to influence that variability, both kinematics, which is influencing the segmental behaviors, distally at the forefoot, proximally at the rear foot to influence what's happening around the midfoot. And then we couple that with an understanding of kinetics, which is simply just how well are you generating force through the foot and the ankle to handle more forces as you simultaneously maintain the position. So when we're loading the ankle plantar flexors as the foot biases pronation, we don't want to spill over into supination. We want to bias that pronation. The same thing with foot supination. We want to try and maintain the foot in supination to allow for the ankle plantar flexors to experience that force while in supination. That can be helpful, for example, if clients are very, very pronated at the foot, for example, and they have been for a long period of time. That forward angle calf raise is a great place to begin, start double leg to make it easier for the client to experience that supination as they simultaneously get higher levels of load into the ankle plantar flexors. And then of course we spoke about pronation, how we can facilitate pronation, how we can facilitate supination, and couple that then with ankle plantar flexion in a loaded manner. So again, like I said, hopefully that made sense. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me directly, and thanks again to Ian for inviting us on.